Conversations across time. 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 Across time. Conversations across time. Conversations across.
Hi, I am Vivienne Crawford. Welcome to another episode of Conversations Across Time, the TV show that allows you, the viewer, to join us for an imaginary conversation between historical figures from different time periods. As always, I am joined by my dear friend and co-host, Babette Josephs. Welcome, Babby.
My pleasure.
And you know, I sometimes forget because we're friends to say former Pennsylvania State Representative Babette Josephs. So you and I are friends, but we want to give you your props.
Well, thank you.
Seated next to Babby is former Governor of Alabama, George Wallace. I want to talk a little bit about George Wallace before I go to our next guest, Mary Chestnut. This is a most interesting panel because in the course of the history of the United States, there have been certain individuals whose public statements during their lifetime fomented racial hatred and civil unrest. These individuals supported negative racial attitudes and advanced stereotypes. Then these individuals experienced a total change in their attitudes and how they responded to people. And so tonight we have two individuals who actually went through this experience. They had a major change in their life that changed who they are and how they think. Seated next to Governor Wallace is Mary Chestnut. Now, Mary Chestnut, for our viewers, she's an immortal and needs to be dealt with and spoken to tonight. But Mary Chestnut was married to Senator James Chestnut. Senator James Chestnut of South Carolina was the first U.S. senator to resign in protest by the Confederate States when they decided they wanted to form their own union. So Mary Chestnut was born into Southern plantation aristocracy. Well, what does that mean? A plantation is a farm that actually has live-in help. And in this case, the live-in help, I'm sorry to say, was slaves. So Mary Chestnut married James Chestnut. She was a part of Southern aristocracy, and certainly Senator Chestnut was part of that Southern aristocracy. Her friends were the elite of her class. Mary Chestnut was educated in Charleston, South Carolina, which was the cosmopolitan city in the South. But in addition to it being a cosmopolitan city, it was also the center for the slave trade. Now, I want to bounce around a little bit because I want to go back to Governor Wallace. Now, Governor Wallace, you were born in Alabama in 1919, and you were governor of Alabama for many times. You were a strong segregationist. In fact, most of us can remember Governor Wallace standing in the doorway at the University of Alabama when black students attempted to desegregate the University of Alabama in June of 1963. You were known for your statement, segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. What's interesting about you, Governor Wallace, and I think most of our viewers don't know this, and certainly I didn't know this about you, is that early in your career you were a judge, and African American attorneys who practiced in front of you said that you were the fairest judge in all of Alabama. You enforced the laws that existed, but you did not deal with racial hatred, so that when a defendant came before you, you just enforced the laws, be he black, be he white, you just enforced them equally. At some point, you decided that you were going to run for higher office, and you ran for governor. Your opponent was someone who was more conservative than you. And after you lost that election, you made a statement. So I'm going to apologize to our viewers, but the only way we can get to the heart of this matter is to reiterate what your statement was. And your statement was, because you lost for being a moderate, you made the determination and you made the statement, I will never be out-niggered again.
That is true, ma'am.
In later life, you reverted back to your moderate leanings, and you actually appointed 2 African Americans to your cabinet. You started visiting African American churches, and you generally started to appear to be a more tolerant individual. But that's not the George Wallace that survives in history and the George Wallace that people know. So my question, I'm going to start with you, Governor Wallace, you're going to be on the hot seat, is sitting here tonight, can you tell us who is the real George Wallace?
To be quite frankly, ma'am, I have had to make some accommodations to the voters of my state so as to attain their votes. Many of the voters in my state, I'm afraid the majority of the voters of my state who voted at that era were very racially biased, and the only way a person can get elected to office was to appeal to their racial bias. Yes, I did run for governor of the state of Alabama, and the first time I did have that reputation as a quote-unquote moderate. And after I had lost, I have come to the realization that only by appealing to the racial prejudices that were very strong in my state could I have ever attained higher office.
So are you saying that you were really a moderate, but you were pretending to be a segregationist? Or were you a segregationist really just pretending to be a moderate?
I am afraid, ma'am, that all along my true instincts were quote-unquote moderate. However...
No, wait a minute. Well, I'm going to ask you this. Just the terminology, I'm afraid that my true inclinations were moderate.
Well, a sign of weakness, I guess, in Alabama in those days.
That is true, madam. I had to appeal, as I have stated, to the strong racist and segregationist beliefs of
because your ambition led you to do that, no matter what it would do to your personality or to the state itself.
That is true,
correct. And there we get to something that I believe is very significant in terms of what is happening today. Your political ambitions outweighed your desire to express who you really are.
To be fair, yes. I don't know what this moderate stuff means really, but he got worse. You got worse.
That is true, ma'am.
To get into office.
Yeah.
No wonder people have so much respect for elected folks, right?
I'm afraid so, ma'am.
And aren't we having that visited upon us today? I call to mind all of these Republicans who were mainstream Republicans who've been pulled to the right to appeal to a constituency that I think is very limited. But I don't know, because it has to do with hypocrisy. And when we talk about hypocrisy, we have to bring Ms. Chestnut into our discussion, because Ms. Chestnut, one of the things that was very significant about your history when I was preparing for this show and reading documents is that you at least addressed the fact that a lot of the Southern aristocracy, your peers, were hypocrites. Do you want to talk about the hypocrisy?
We were all hypocrites at that time. The aristocracy was, of course, much more hypocritical because we came from money. We were plantation and slave owners. And so, Ms. Crawford, there was a certain glee that we would have when something would go wrong with the black people.
Well, now, this is a conversation across time, and I do appreciate you updating your language, but that's not what you called us.
No, we called them niggas, because that's what we were taught. And as I said, there was glee involved. If there was to be a hanging, we would gather around.
As a social event.
What fun. Boy, oh boy.
Yes.
I'm sorry I missed that era.
Well, if you don't mind, if I
Of course, please.
have the floor for another moment, I have to say, not just in my defense, but in defense of that entire generation at that time, we were not educated other than how we were educated. And we were educated
That's
to think.
true of everybody.
Exactly my point being.
But some people use their brains.
And I
but-
did
but-
eventually use
Yes,
my
But-
brain.
but Miss- Miss-
and my
eventually.
heart.
You did
Ms. Chestnut,
eventually.
but I
did.
have to say, when you say we were not educated, here's what we know. We know that you attended school
Yes.
in South Carolina. My French is very rusty. Madame Tivalde's
Devon.
school for the upwardly, of the upper crust
Yes.
of Southern society.
Yes.
And that was a school that was led by a woman who was French. And what we know, what we know is that, certainly from other guests we've had here, we certainly had a conversation with Ms. Baker, Josephine Baker, and what we know is that slavery was not allowed in France.
And not only that, they did not allow discrimination against people based on the color of their skin, which is why Josephine Baker was in France
To
as
begin
long
with.
as she was.
I
And so-
believe the point that I was
Okay.
trying to make as far as education is quite simply this. You are brought up, I was brought up as a child with this sense of,
Entitlement.
exactly, and that the niggers were less than us. I have since,
And plenty of white people, too, I would think.
I would think, yes,
Sure. Why not be on top of a big heap?
I would, exactly.
And I'm going to say this, as you know, we have certain constraints. We're going to take a break, and what we're going to do is come back and ask Governor Wallace to respond, because he's coming from a later period of time, to respond to your orientation as a Southern aristocrat. So if you will please come back, we'll take a break, and we'll be back, and we'll take this topic up again. Thank you so much.
That would be my pleasure.
So here I am, waiting for a bus on a street corner when my friend Vivienne drives by in a car and says, "Babette, I want you. I need you." So I thought, sure, and I had a card with me, my business card. I gave it to her, and I thought, I probably won't hear from Vivienne again for a while, but right away she emailed me, she called me, and now I'm doing her concept, which is really, really interesting, to make history alive and to relate it to what's happening now in our country and our world. And Vivienne dragged me into it. Oh, I can't say I really resisted too hard. And that's what I'm doing.
Just before the break, Governor Wallace, I wanted to ask you to respond to the statements made by Ms. Chestnut regarding her background. I'm sorry.
Excuse me, please.
Yes.
I do not mean to appear rude, but I would like to make a certain little correction here.
Isn't it funny how the Southerners tell us they don't want to be rude, but they are? But that's okay.
I don't want to appear rude, actually, is what I said.
Yes, you did. I'm so sorry.
That's all right. What I'd like to say is that you're just a little off in your facts. You see, Madame Talon came from Haiti after the war, after the revolution. She was not from France.
So she lived in a French colony.
Yes.
Indeed.
Which would then sort of give you an excuse as to why you didn't recoil at the institution of slavery.
Not only that, mostly because it was the way I was brought up as a child. That is how we were brought up.
But afterwards?
Afterwards is a different story now, Miss Babette. That's a whole different story. And I will let it go at that.
What does the governor think of all of that?
Yes.
Well, madam, ladies, I must admit that I come from a class of people who did not have the advantages that Ms. Chestnut had. I come from among people who were not very well educated and who have always been brought up to believe that force and violence was the appropriate masculine way of resolving problems.
Well, let me stop you there. That force and violence was the appropriate masculine way. Now,
that is true, madam.
well, Babette, you and I certainly, being from this century, have a different notion about the machismo here. But Ms. Chestnut,
Ma'am.
force and violence is the appropriate way to resolve. The reason I ask that question is because at one point, I believe, and I think I have, you corrected me before, so I want to be accurate. You made a statement at the beginning of the Civil War, oh, we're going to have us a lovely little war.
Yes, I did, ma'am.
So
Then you learned something different, though.
you learned something different, but it sounds to me as though Governor Wallace is, even though he wasn't raised within the aristocracy of the South, he certainly echoes, I mean, that seems to be an idea that managed to carry over.
Sadly, you are correct.
But I'm sorry, I interrupted you, Governor Wallace. Please continue.
It is true, madam. For the longest time, ever since the end of that war, we have been, what you call the Civil War, we have been taught to recall the War of Northern Aggression. And we have never, quite as you say in this era, gotten over it. It is in our heritage. It is as if we have never reconciled ourselves to the loss of our independence as a nation. And
When you say your independence, you're talking about the Confederate nation.
that is
Right,
true,
and
madam.
Yes,
your
not all
loss of
Southerners are that
slave
way.
labor,
Yes.
upon which your economy was based.
Yes, and to be quite honest, many of the men who I have grown up with in the South, and in particular my home state, are not very well educated, and they don't feel very secure as human beings. And so they seek solace in the fact of this supposedly inferior race of people that they would feel superior to.
Now, when the
It
inferior
doesn't
race
take lack
being
of
black.
education to feel that way, by the way, Governor. There's plenty of people with plenty of education who feel that way, unfortunately, but true.
Today.
Very accurate statement.
That is true, ladies, and I repent for the fact that I have played on those sentiments in my ambition for higher office.
But did you feel that way because you got shot and you were suffering and you were weak and you were looking for friends, or did you really feel that way? And if you really felt that way, why did you wander from that path and stand in front of the schoolhouse door?
Segregation,
Segregation now.
segregation tomorrow, segregation forever.
Now you changed your mind.
It is true, madam.
What did you do when you were in power? That's what counts.
It is true, ladies. I had played on segregationist sentiments in order to attain greater power, and I was enthralled by the fact that I was a national political figure. I enjoyed the fact that in 1968, when I ran in the third party for the presidency, along with General Curtis LeMay, I enjoyed the idea of possibly bringing the election to the Electoral College and then to the House of Representatives, and perhaps bringing an end to the attempt, yes, madam, to bringing an end to the possibility of integration and restoring the
Another
segregation.
dream.
This
Another
is
dream.
so gratuitous.
So,
You're a man. You're a man, and
Yes, I am.
as Miss Crawford so eloquently put it, there is that machismo, that testosteronal
Come on.
element that
With-
pulls.
Come on,
out
we
the
just have a
ugliness.
culture that lets them be ugly.
With
Well-
all due respect, Ms. Chestnut, the men in my culture do feel very insecure and quite frankly, ready to spoil for a fight, and which attracts them to such organizations as the Ku Klux Klan, which gives them an opportunity to vent their violence.
I want to jump. This is, you know what's
Very
interesting
honorable.
about this? Because you mentioned the 1968 election. First of all, you ran for president 4 times. The first time you ran as a Democrat. But in 1964, you approached the Goldwater people because Barry Goldwater was clearly going to be the nominee for the Republican Party for president. So you approached the Goldwater camp and said to them that you would be willing to change your party affiliation from Democrat to Republican. Now, I think what our viewers need to understand is that in 1964, all Southerners, or predominantly the Southerners in power, were Democrats, or better known as Dixiecrats. So for you to even make the statement that you would even fathom switching to a Republican Party was something that was unbelievable. Now, of course, you were solidly rebuffed by the Goldwater people because they didn't see you as having any sort of life, any sort of legs, as it were, outside of the South. However, in 1968, Richard Nixon recognized the power of your message and knew that you could be a threat to him when it comes to blue-collar voters. Now, we're going to talk about, at a later point, we're going to talk about the blue-collar voters and how even today they tend to be led by or be a part of the Tea Party movement, following the Republican agenda, which has nothing to do with them, which is very much...
Doesn't protect their
Not at all. They're voting against their own interests. But I find it interesting, Governor Wallace, that you were able to make that transition to even say, we talk about these changes, and you made it seems to me that you said you were never going to be out-niggered again, which was against your moderate background. And now, in 1964, you get to the point to say, well, I'm prepared to no longer be a Democrat and vote with the Republican Party. Now, for those of us, the viewers today, know that the Republican Party represents the South now. But in 1964, it did not.
But part of that was what the Republican Party learned from watching Wallace and how he brought in votes in the South.
Yes.
And certainly Nixon learned that. And now we have a South where all of the people in power are Republicans and there are no Democrats left, basically. Now that's going to change again very soon. But that was you.
So how did you get, I guess I'm trying to understand. So when you ran for president in 64, you were prepared to change party affiliation.
Well, he ran as an independent.
Right.
He ran 4 times for president and only 3 times as a Democrat.
That is true, ma'am.
But the Republican Party recognized that you could pull in northern votes. Richard Nixon, for all of us from that era, who we call Tricky Dick, realized that, in fact,
When we're being kind.
yes, exactly, and realized that you had power in the North. And we will talk about that, but I'm sorry, I just had to jump in and throw that in when you were talking about your presidential.
I would like
Yes,
to say
please.
something, excuse me, in defense of Mr. Wallace, to you, Ms. Babette. And that is, you know, you said it's important what you did when you were in office.
In power.
And-
what did you do when you had the power?
Well, exactly. And the thing is that regardless of what he did when he was in power, which we know now, in retrospect, it was not pretty, but he did have an epiphany, didn't he?
After he was not in power anymore.
But isn't this
Not
whole
so
life
much, anyway.
about moving forward and learning and
The question is, what did you do when you had the power? So, Ms. Chestnut, when you had the power to influence perhaps certain people, maybe not very many people, in your aristocratic milieu, what did you do when you had that power?
When I had that power, I entertained, unfortunately, because my husband was a senator, and that was my role. People loved me. They enjoyed my sense of humor, my wit. The point is
Your
that...
costumes.
Yeah, exactly. The point is that after the war had begun, and after I realized that my husband and the men of the South, and that's all I knew, were just that. They were men. And I didn't like what was happening to us as women, and I didn't like what was happening during the war. It was ugly.
Ms. Chestnut, we are going to ask you to delve a little more into that. We have to take a break, but when we come back from the break,
I would love
to us as women,
Yes.
today that speaks to us, and we certainly want to know what that meant to you during the 19th century, because here in the 21st century, we have particular notions and proclivities, and we'd like to like you to speak about yours so that we can compare them.
And there's so much more, and I will.
Ms. Chestnut, and I know that Babette also agrees with me, find that particularly interesting when you say we as referring to women. Yes. Being from the 21st century, we're very interested to hear what you have to say. Unfortunately, we have time constraints. So I would like to invite you back so that we can have some illumination on the position that you felt as a 19th century woman speaking about the rights of women.
I would be honored. Thank you.
And so we would ask our guests to please come back, join us at a later point when we invite this distinguished panel back to have a discussion. First of all, talking about women's rights, but also we have further questions for Governor Wallace. Thank you so much. This has been Conversations Across Time. Please join us again next week. Thank you.
Conversations across time. 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 Across time. Conversations across time. Conversations across time.